The cattle started bawling before sunrise, not the low, rolling sound of a herd moving toward morning hay. This was different, shorter, more insistent, the kind of sound a man learns to recognize after enough summers. Cattle calling for water that isn't coming. Across the low country south of Millard Creek, the power had been out for 31 hours. The storms had rolled through 2 nights before. Nothing apocalyptic, just a hard Kansas line of thunderstorms with straight-line winds that had taken down power poles along 3 rural co-op lines. The co-op crews were working, but there were a lot of poles and not enough hours in the day. Cal Pritchard was already up. He'd been up since 4, standing beside his south pasture tank, watching the water level with a flashlight. The float was low, not dry, but low enough to matter. His electric pump was silent. He'd started his generator the night before, but somewhere around midnight it had developed a miss, and by 3 in the morning he'd pulled the cord a dozen times and gotten nothing useful out of it. Now he was calculating how long it would take to haul water with the flatbed tank trailer, how many trips he needed to make before the morning heat pushed his cattle to the water's edge in numbers the tank couldn't support. His neighbor Dale Hooper had already moved his cows twice in 12 hours. The far pasture tank had gone flat dry by midday of the first day. Dale had spent the afternoon stringing extension cord to a borrowed generator, then given up on that and called 3 different water haulers, only to find them all already committed to other farms, a mile and a half to the northeast. Up the gravel road past the creek crossing, Martha Keene's south pasture tank had dropped about 8 inches since the storm hit. But it had not gone dry. It was still going down slowly, but it was also still going up, slowly. Not fast, not impressively. Just a trickle of cold well water, lifted by a mechanical pump that did not need electricity, driven by a 12-foot fan turning in the morning breeze, above an old tower that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and stubbornness. That is exactly what it was. The cattle in Martha's south pasture were gathered near the tank. They always are in late summer heat. But they were drinking, not bawling, drinking, and the story of how that tank stayed alive, when every other pump in the county went silent, began about 8 months earlier, on a cold March morning, in the back of the Millard Creek Farm Co-op equipment yard. The yard smelled like motor oil and rust and old rubber. The ordinary smell of any farm co-op's back storage area, where the equipment that was no longer worth fixing went to wait out its final days. There were disc blades stacked against a fence, a cultivator frame with a broken toolbar, 3 old grain auger sections, and, laid out along the far fence in pieces that someone had obviously not cared very much about keeping organized, the remains of an old farm windmill. Frank Dalton found Martha Keene standing in front of it at 8:20 on a Tuesday morning. Frank had managed the co-op yard for 11 years. He was a patient man with a practical disposition, and he liked Martha Keene, the way most people in the county liked her, quietly and with respect, the way you like someone who has farmed the same ground for 40 years without making a spectacle of herself. When he saw her crouching down beside the windmill's rusted fan blades, he walked over and stood nearby, hands in his jacket pockets. "Morning, Martha." Frank. She didn't look up. She was turning one of the fan blades slowly, testing where the rust had eaten through versus where it was surface only. "That came off the old Hendricks demonstration well," Frank said. "County updated the demonstration plot back in the fall. Nobody wanted the windmill. We were going to scrap it out." "When?" "End of the month, probably." She set the blade down and moved to the gearbox housing. It was a rusted, square-bodied unit with a seized input shaft. She put a hand on the shaft and tried to turn it. It did not move. "Gearbox is locked up," Frank said. "Probably hasn't had oil in 15 years. The fan blades, 2 of them are bent. One is cracked. The tail vane is cracked all the way through. The pump rod connection is corroded. Tower sections are there." He pointed to a stack of angle iron tower legs leaning against the fence. "But the braces are bent and some of the bolts are missing." Martha looked at the tower sections. Then she looked at the pump rod, which was lying in the mud beside the gearbox. She crouched down and looked at the end fitting. It was corroded but intact. "What are you getting for it?" she said. Frank paused. "Scrap weight. $140. Martha straightened up. She was 67 years old and moved the way a person moves who has spent a lifetime around cattle and cold mornings, deliberately, without wasted motion. She wore a canvas jacket, work gloves tucked in the pocket, and boots that had seen several winters. Her hair was gray and cut short. She did not look romantic. She looked like a woman who was trying to figure out if something was worth fixing. "Martha," Frank said, not unkindly, "I want to be honest with you. That gearbox is going to need a machine shop, or at minimum someone who really knows these old units. The blades, you can probably straighten 2 of them, but the cracked one's gone. You'll need to source a replacement. The leathers in that pump cylinder are probably rotted through. It's going to take a lot of work for something that'll pump maybe 4 or 5 gallons a minute on a good wind day." He paused. Modern submersible pump puts that in the shade. Martha looked at the fan blades again. She turned one of them over to check the hub. The hub was solid. "Load every piece," she said. Word traveled the way word travels in a small county. Not all at once, but steadily, the way water finds low ground. By that Friday, Cal Pritchard had heard about it at the co-op coffee counter. Martha Keene bought that old windmill they were scrapping out, someone said. Cal wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and shook his head slowly. He was 54, a good farmer, a practical man. He ran 300 head of cow-calf pairs on good bottomland and upland pasture. He had 3 electric submersible pumps and a 6-kilowatt generator for backup. He had done the math on his water system more than once. "She get a good deal on it?" "Scrap price." "Well," Cal said, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he is being kind about something he thinks is foolish, "I suppose she's got the right, but she's going to spend more fixing it than it's worth." He thought about it a moment. "I didn't know Martha was interested in bringing back 1910. The man across the table laughed. The conversation moved on. Ruth Keene was 35 and had been helping manage her mother's farm for going on 8 years, ever since her father died, and Martha had continued operating the place the way she always had, with careful judgment and very little outside help. Ruth was good at cattle records, good at calving season logistics, good at knowing which pasture needed rotation. She trusted her mother completely on most things. When the flatbed pulled in with the windmill pieces, she stood in the farmyard and looked at them for a long moment. "Mom, help me get the gearbox off the trailer, Mom. That thing is rusted solid." "I know what it is." They got the gearbox on the ground. Ruth looked at the fan blades. 2 bent, 1 cracked, paint gone, rust heavy on the trailing edges. She looked at the tower sections piled beside the barn. She looked at the broken tail vane. "Why?" she finally said. Martha was already sorting the pieces, pulling out the ones that could be used, setting aside the ones that needed machine work, checking the straightness of the tower legs one by one. She did not answer immediately. Ruth tried a different direction. "If you need more water capacity in the south pasture, we could put in a second submersible pump. Co-op has a good deal on. We've got enough capacity when the power's on," Martha said. Ruth stopped. "When the power's on," she repeated. Martha set down a tower leg and looked at her daughter. "Come with me." The old well site was in the corner of the south pasture, near the windbreak trees, where the ground leveled out before the creek bank. It had been capped for a long time. The well casing stuck up about 18 inches above grade, covered with a bolted steel plate, unused since the electric pump system had been extended to that pasture sometime in the mid-1980s. Beside the capped well was an old concrete stock tank, cracked along one side and dry, and nearby there was still a poured concrete pad, faded, overgrown around the edges, that had once been the windmill's foundation. Martha stood beside the well casing and pointed to the stock tank, then to the pad, then to the electric pump line running across the fence from the next pasture. "That electric line goes to 1 pump," she said. "Pump runs off the co-op grid. Grid goes down, pump stops. Tank's got maybe," she looked at the dry concrete tank, "maybe 200 gallons capacity on that side. 60, 70 head of cattle on a hot day will drink that down in 4 hours. Ruth looked at the old foundation pad. She was starting to understand the shape of what her mother was thinking, but she wasn't all the way there yet. "You're putting the windmill here," Ruth said. "Over the old well, casing still sound. I had it checked 2 years ago when I was thinking about this." Ruth looked at the cracked fan blades on the ground, back at the barn in her mind. She thought about Ben Rooker. the old well mechanic who had kept the county's remaining windmills alive for 30 years, and whether he would take on something in this condition. A windmill that's slow, even repaired, Ruth said carefully. Won't replace the electric pump, Martha said. That's not what it's for. She looked at the old well casing for a moment. Fast water is fine when everything is working, she said. But fast water doesn't matter when the pump is silent. Ruth was quiet. A tank is only as reliable as what keeps filling it, Martha said. Then she turned and walked back toward the barn, and Ruth stood at the old well site for a while longer, looking at the cracked stock tank and the empty concrete pad, and thinking about what her mother had just said. Ben Rooker drove out the following Tuesday. He was 71, had a bad knee, and had spent 40 years servicing the windmills and hand pumps and old pressure systems that dotted the county before rural electrification made them obsolete. And then the stragglers who had kept theirs running anyway, usually because they had a pasture too far from the line, or a well that the submersible pump couldn't reach. He had seen a lot of broken windmills in his time. He walked around the pieces in Martha's barn lot with the expression of a man reading a long and somewhat depressing letter. Gearbox is locked, he said. I know. Could be the bearings, could be the bull gear. If the bull gear's cracked, you're sourcing a part that may not exist anymore. Will you open it up? Ben crouched down and put his hand on the gearbox housing. He tapped it with his knuckle in a couple of places, listening. He tried the input shaft again, harder. Bring me a cheater bar, he said. An hour later, the gearbox was open on a piece of plywood in the barn. The bull gear was intact, worn but intact. The bearings were dry and corroded but not destroyed. The input shaft had seized from rust and old dried grease. Ben sat on an overturned bucket and looked at the internals. Bearings I can repack, he said. Shaft I can free up with some work, it'll turn. He looked at the fan blades laid out beside the barn wall. 2 of those I can straighten. One's cracked. You need a replacement blade. I've got a line on one, Martha said. Farm auction over in Calhoun County next week. They've got a parts windmill in the lot. Ben looked at her. You've been thinking about this for a while. Martha didn't answer that directly. What about the pump cylinder? Leathers are gone. Need a rebuild kit. I can get those from the well supply house in town. He stood up slowly, favoring the knee. Tower sections need new bolts throughout. 2 of the diagonal braces need to be straightened or replaced. He looked out toward the south pasture where the old well site was. How deep's that well? 42 feet to water. Old dug well or driven. 6-inch casing. Drilled back in the 40s. Ben was quiet for a moment. It'll pump, he said finally, in the voice of a man who is still reserving judgment on whether that's a good idea. I'll tell you that much. Whether it's worth the work. It's worth the work, Martha said. They spent 3 weekends on it. Ben freed the gearbox shaft and repacked the bearings. Martha came back from the Calhoun County auction with a replacement fan blade, and Ben and Ruth spent a Saturday afternoon straightening the 2 bent blades on the concrete floor of the shop with a hydraulic jack and a lot of patience. The cracked tail vane was replaced with a piece of heavy sheet steel that Ben welded into shape with a borrowed welder. It did not look factory, but it was solid. The pump cylinder came up out of the old well with some effort. Ben rebuilt it with new leathers, new seals, new pump cups. He had the pump rod cleaned and inspected and recoupled to the gearbox output. Setting the tower was the hardest part. It was 4 sections of angle iron lattice, bolted together with new hardware, anchored to the old concrete pad. Ben and Martha and Ruth and a cousin named Darrell, who had come out to help, wrestled the sections into place over a long Saturday with a come-along and a rope over a barn beam, serving as the only mechanical assist. The tower went up crooked twice and had to come down. The 3rd time it went straight, and Ben bolted the base plates and stood back and looked at it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done something difficult correctly. The windmill head went up last. It was ugly. The blades were 3 different shades of rust and paint and bare metal. The tail vane was homemade. The gearbox housing was dinged and repainted with whatever gray paint Martha had in the shop. The tower had a lean to it that was not quite noticeable, but was there if you looked. Ruth stood in the pasture and looked at it. It's not pretty, she said. No, Martha said. Cal Pritchard drives by here. He's going to have something to say. Probably. They connected the pump rod to the well casing fitting and ran a 2-inch line from the pump discharge to the old stock tank. Ben had patched the crack in the tank with hydrolyte cement and let it cure for a week. The tank was filled partway with the garden hose to test it. The patch held. On the first calm afternoon after the installation, nothing happened. The fan turned slowly through one partial rotation and stopped. On the second day, there was a light south wind. The fan began to turn. The pump rod began to move. Up, down, with a creak that sounded like a barn door on a cold morning. For the first minute, nothing came out of the discharge pipe. Then a sputter. Then a gurgle. Then a trickle of cold, clear water that ran along the bottom of the concrete stock tank. Ruth watched it. The trickle continued. Not fast. Not impressive. Maybe the width of a finger. It ran into the tank, and the sound it made was soft and steady and not dramatic in any way. "That's it," she said. "That's it. Mom, that'll take." She looked at the tank. "That'll take 2 days to fill that tank. If it blows steady," Ben said from where he was checking the tower bolt tension. "Lighter wind, more. Heavier wind, less. What fills that in an hour?" "The electric pump," Martha said. "So, when the electric pump is running," Martha said, "it fills the tank in an hour. This one takes 2 days. When the electric pump stops." She looked at the discharge trickle. "This one still runs." Ruth watched the water entering the tank, thin and slow and continuous. "It's not fast," she said. "It doesn't need to be fast," Martha said. "It needs to be awake when everything else is asleep." Ben tightened a tower bolt and did not say anything. The summer moved the way eastern Kansas summers do, slowly and hotly, with the grass browning by July and the cattle spending more time near the tanks in the afternoon heat. Martha moved the south pasture herd down to the lower ground in late July, where the creek bottom grass was still holding green. She ran 43 cow-calf pairs through the south pasture, rotating them in 3-week intervals. The windmill ran on good wind days. It did not run much on still days. The old stock tank in the corner of the south pasture accumulated water slowly and held it, a few hundred gallons cycling through, as the small amount of cattle she put through that corner drank and the fan replenished. She adjusted the cattle rotation, so the south pasture corner was never overstocked. She wanted the windmill tank to maintain a reserve rather than be drawn down continuously. She checked the pump rod every week. She greased the gearbox. She watched the tail vane track the wind. She watched the water level in the tank. Ruth helped without fully understanding the calculation yet. She recorded water levels in her farm notebook the way Martha had asked. Tank level in the morning, wind direction, fan movement, cattle count in the pasture. She filled in the numbers. She did not yet see the picture they were making. Cal Pritchard drove by on the gravel road in early August and slowed his truck. He looked at the windmill through his window for a long moment. He was too polite to stop and say anything directly, but he told his wife that evening that Martha Keene had put up an old scrap windmill over that abandoned well on the south pasture, and it looked like something his grandfather had farmed under. He meant it gently. He also meant it as the kind of comment a man makes when he is confident that modern equipment has already solved the problem being addressed by old equipment. And he does not need to think about it further. The forecast for the 3rd week of August came in on a Wednesday. A line of severe thunderstorms was moving up out of Oklahoma, with a secondary system dropping out of Nebraska. The Co-op Extension Office sent out an advisory about potential wind damage. The National Weather Service issued a severe thunderstorm watch for a 6-county area. The language was careful and measured, the way weather language always is, but the numbers behind it were not small. Predicted winds 45 to 60 miles an hour, quarter-sized hail possible, and a note about the unusually long duration of the event, which was forecast to move slowly. Martha read the forecast on Thursday morning and spent that day doing the same things she always did before a storm. She checked gates. She counted cattle in each pasture. She drove out to the south pasture and stood by the windmill tank and watched the fan turning in the building's south wind. The pump rod was moving steadily. The tank was full. She drove back to the farm and put her generator on the checklist. She filled the generator's fuel tank and ran it for 20 minutes to make sure it started. She had 8 gallons of gas in reserve cans in the shop. Then she went inside and made dinner. And in the morning the storms came. The first cell hit after midnight, hard rain, lightning, and then a period of very high wind that lasted 40 minutes. When it passed, the power was already gone. Martha had expected that. She went out with a flashlight and checked the barn and the cattle in the home pasture, and came back inside and slept until 5. By morning, the second system was on radar and moving in. The co-op reported 2 major feeder lines down, one near the substation, one where a pole had come down on a county road. The repair timeline was uncertain. They were prioritizing the feeder line near the substation, but the road situation was complicating access. By noon on the first day, the electric pumps across the area had been silent for 12 hours. Martha started the generator and ran it for 3 hours to top off the tanks on the home pasture and the north lot. The generator used about a gallon an hour, and she had 9 gallons. She was careful. She was watching the fuel gauge the way you watch a water level. In the south pasture, the windmill was turning. The storms had brought heavy wind, and then periods of lighter wind between cells. During the heavy wind, the fan had furled slightly, the tail vane working the way it was designed to, keeping the fan from overspinning. During the light wind, it turned steadily. The pump rod moved up and down. Water entered the tank in a thin, continuous stream. By midday of the first day, the south pasture tank had dropped 8 inches. With 43 cow-calf pairs drinking heavily in the late summer heat, and cattle always drink more when they are unsettled by a storm, the draw was significant. But the windmill was putting back maybe 2 gallons a minute when the wind was running, and for the past 4 hours the south wind had been consistent. The tank was low. It was not dry. Cal Pritchard called at 11 o'clock on the first day. "Martha, your generator holding up?" "Running," she said. "How about yours?" A pause. "Started having trouble last night. Running rough. I think it's the carburetor. I've had the same issue with it before. I just never got around to getting it fixed proper." Another pause. "My south tank is down maybe 1.5 feet. I've got the hauling trailer, but Dale Hooper's been calling the same water service I use. Might be a wait." "How many head on that pasture?" 86 cow-calf pairs." Martha was quiet for a moment. 86 cow-calf pairs on a hot day with no pump running and a tank already down 1.5 feet. That was a serious situation. "You might look at moving some of them to the north lot," she said. "Take the pressure off the south tank while you work on the generator." "Yeah," Cal said. "Yeah, that's probably what I'll do." Another pause. "Martha, you got any trouble on that back pasture? That old well you put the—" "Tank's low, but it's filling," she said. A longer pause this time. "How?" he said. "Wind's been out of the south all morning," she said. She let that sit there without adding anything to it. "Right," Cal said finally. "Well, okay, I'll let you know how we make out." By the end of the first full day without power, Dale Hooper had moved 20 cows to a borrowed lot on his brother-in-law's place 2 miles away. The water hauler had finally arrived at noon and made 2 trips, but the cost was significant and the timing had been a near thing. Dale's far pasture tank was still dropping. A farmer named Jerry Voss, 3 miles east of Cal, had lost his generator entirely to what turned out to be a seized alternator. He spent the afternoon on the phone trying to rent a replacement and finally drove 2 hours round trip to get one from a rental outfit in the next county. He made it back at dusk and had the pump running again by 8 in the evening, but his tank had dropped to less than a foot of water, and his cattle had been crowded around it in the heat all afternoon, bawling steadily. By the second morning, almost every tank south of Millard Creek was either low, dry, or being kept alive by hauled water. The tanks had not failed because the wells were gone. They had failed because nothing was running to fill them. None of this was catastrophic. Nobody lost cattle, but the margin had been thin, and the effort had been enormous. Fuel, time, money, borrowed equipment, long drives, and the kind of exhausted resourcefulness that a farmer draws on when things go wrong faster than the solutions can arrive. On the second morning, the power was still out. Martha was at the south pasture tank before 6. The tank had dropped 11 inches overnight. She stood at the edge and looked at the water level. Still visible, still workable, but lower than she liked. The cattle were already moving toward the tank as the sun came up, the pairs drifting in from the overnight grazing ground. Calves following their mothers with the simple urgency of young animals. who understand that the morning drink is the important one. The windmill was turning. The south wind had been steady through the night and was still moving. Not strong, maybe 10 miles an hour, but consistent. The pump rod was moving steadily. She put her hand on the discharge pipe and felt the water moving through it. She looked at where it entered the tank. The thin stream, continuous, unhurried. She had done the math more than once in the weeks before the storm. A light wind day might give her 300 gallons over 12 hours. A moderate wind day, 600. The storm's wind had been inconsistent, heavy, and then calm, and then moderate, and she estimated she had gotten maybe 400 gallons into the tank overnight, against a draw of perhaps 600 from the herd. The tank was down, but it was not empty. Ruth arrived an hour later and stood beside her at the tank. "Level's down," Ruth said. 11 inches, Martha said. Ruth did the calculation in her head. She looked at the windmill. "Wind's supposed to hold out of the south today," she said. "Through the afternoon, yes." Ruth looked at the tank level again. She looked at the discharge stream. She looked at the cattle drinking steadily along the tank's edge. "They're still drinking," she said. "Yes." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "The electric pump's faster," she said, not as an argument, more like a statement she was examining from a new angle. "Faster doesn't help when the pump is silent," Martha said. "The question was never how fast the tank fills when the power is on. The question was what fills the tank when the power is off." Ruth looked at the windmill, at the creaking gearbox housing, at the fan blades turning in 3 different shades of rust and paint and bare metal, at the ugly homemade tail vane tracking the morning wind. "You were never trying to replace the electric pump," Ruth said. "No," Martha said. "You were keeping one tank alive. Just long enough," Martha said. "Just long enough for the herd to make it through." Ben Rooker drove out that afternoon. He had heard about the outage, and he wanted to see how the windmill was handling it. He walked out to the south pasture in the afternoon heat, moving with the careful gait of a man with a bad knee who has stopped worrying about looking graceful. He stood at the tank and looked at the water level. He looked at the discharge stream. He put his hand on the tower leg and felt the steady vibration of the pump rod moving up and down inside the casing. He walked around the tank and looked at the cattle. 43 pairs, some drinking, some standing in the shade of the windbreak trees, some watching him with the mild suspicion of cattle who have decided a stranger is not worth running from. He looked at the electric pump line running across the fence from the next pasture, silent. The float switch was set and waiting for a pump that was not running. He came back and stood beside Martha. "How much has it dropped?" he said. 11 inches. "Since when?" "Yesterday morning." He looked at the discharge stream. "Wind's been decent today, yes." He was quiet for a while, watching the pump rod move and the water enter the tank. "You know," he said, "I've watched a lot of these things over the years. Slow as anything. Farmers put in the electric pump, and the windmill sat there and nobody wanted to look at it anymore, because it was slow and ugly, and the electric pump did the same job in 10 minutes that the windmill took all day to do." He paused. "They weren't wrong about that. Electric pump is faster." "Yes," Martha said. "But fast doesn't matter right now." He watched the trickle entering the tank. "Right now the only thing that matters is what's still running." He turned and looked at her. "You didn't save the cattle by pumping faster," he said. "You saved them by pumping when nothing else could." Martha looked at the tank. "That was the part I needed," she said. The power came back in the evening of the second day. The co-op crews had worked through both nights, and the feeder line repair was completed at 5:47 in the afternoon. Across the county, electric pumps hummed back to life. Submersible motors that had been silent for 36 hours began pulling water again. Tanks that had fallen dangerously low began to refill. Martha's electric pump line came on and she heard the soft vibration of the submersible engaging in the north lot tank. She walked out to the south pasture and looked at the windmill. The fan was still turning. The pump rod was still moving. The discharge stream was still running into the tank. She left it running. She turned the electric pump on the south pasture as well, letting both systems work together for the rest of the evening. By dark, the south pasture tank was back to its normal level. The windmill kept turning in the night wind. adding its slow and steady contribution to a tank that no longer needed it critically. But that, for 36 hours, it had kept alive when nothing else could. In the days that followed, Cal Pritchard was quiet about it. He drove past the windmill more than once on his way to South Pasture. He did not stop and say anything. But Ruth, who happened to be fixing a gate near the road one afternoon, saw his truck slow down on the gravel, saw him look at the old tower with its mismatched blades and homemade tail vane, and saw him sit there for a moment before he drove on. He called Martha a week after the power was restored. The conversation was brief. "How much water did that windmill put in during the outage?" "I don't know exactly," Martha said. "Enough, enough," he repeated. "My tank didn't go dry," she said. A pause. "No," he said. "I heard it didn't. I've been thinking about that old Dawson well on my east pasture," he said. "Capped back in '87. I don't know if the casing's still any good." "Have it checked," Martha said. "Yeah." He was quiet. "You know anyone who knows these old windmill setups?" "Ben Rooker," she said. "Right," Cal said. "I'll give him a call." He did not apologize. Martha did not say anything about 1910. The conversation ended the way conversations between practical people often end, with both parties understanding something that had not needed to be stated out loud. The windmill needed work after the outage. Ben came back out and tightened tower bolts that had vibrated slightly loose during the storm winds. He adjusted the tail vane, which had developed a small wobble in the high wind period of the storm. He re-greased the gearbox. He checked the pump leathers and found them in decent shape. The tank had hoof prints in the mud around it, deep, close-set prints where the cattle had stood crowded at the edge during the worst of the drawdown. The grass around the tank was trampled flat. The concrete tank had a new smear of mud along the waterline. It looked exactly like a water source that had been used hard by animals that needed it. Ben filled the oiler on the gearbox and stood back and looked at the windmill in the morning light. It was still ugly. The blades were still mismatched. The tail vane was still homemade. The tower had that slight lean that was not quite noticeable unless you stood at the right angle. "She's going to need new leathers by next spring," he said. "Put them on the list," Martha said. Ruth started keeping a different kind of record in her farm notebook. She had always recorded tank levels, cattle counts, feed orders, and calving dates. She continued doing all of that, but after that August, she added a column she had not thought to track before: wind direction and windmill pump status in the South Pasture. She recorded it every morning when she walked the pastures. She also, that fall, drove out to 2 farm auctions, looking for windmill parts. She didn't find what she was looking for at the first one. At the second, she came home with a replacement fan blade in good condition and a rebuilt pump cylinder still in the box. She stored them in the shop. Martha found them there one morning and did not say anything. She just looked at them for a moment, and then went on with her day. That winter, the county extension office put out a bulletin about backup water systems following the summer outages. The bulletin mentioned generators, hauling capacity, and tank reserve sizing. It did not mention windmills. Martha read it at the kitchen table and set it down without comment. Months later, in early spring, another storm watch went up on the radio. Not a severe outbreak, just the ordinary threat of a Kansas spring, power lines and wind and uncertainty. Ruth heard it on the truck radio on her way back from the feed store. She turned down the gravel road toward the South Pasture. She did not go to the electric pump switch first. She walked to the windmill. She checked the tail vane, moving freely, tracking the south wind. She checked the fan. Turning steadily, she put her hand on the pump rod and felt it moving. She looked at the discharge pipe and watched the water entering the tank. She walked to the well casing and checked the bolted cover plate. She walked around the tower and checked the base bolts. She looked at the grease fitting on the gearbox and made a note to bring the grease gun in the morning. She looked at the tank level, full, where it should be. Then she walked to the fence and checked the electric switch, running fine. She stood there for a moment, looking from the electric pump line to the windmill and back. Then she wrote the windmill status in her notebook first, and the electric pump status second. Not because the windmill was more important on an ordinary day, but because she had learned what her mother understood. that the windmill was the one that mattered most on the day when ordinary ended. The old tower still stands in the south pasture corner, near the windbreak trees where the ground levels out before the creek bank. The fan blades are still 3 different colors, still mismatched and patched. The tail vane is still homemade. The gearbox creaks in cold weather. Ben Rooker has been back twice to adjust it. It pumps about 4 gallons a minute on a good wind day. It pumps 0 gallons when the wind is still. On most days, the electric pump fills the tank faster, cleaner, and without the creak and wobble of old metal working against rust and time. But the windmill does not need a power line. It does not need a generator. It does not need fuel. It does not need someone present to start it. It needs wind and gravity, and a few worn parts maintained by a man who still knows how these old systems work. The county had 3 extended outages in the 5 years that followed. Each time, the south pasture tank dropped. Each time, the windmill kept turning, and the tank did not go dry. The co-op sold that windmill for scrap. Martha Keene bought every piece, Suksuri, for more rural stories about forgotten farm wisdom that still works when it matters. By the next storm watch, Ruth checked what filled the tank before she checked the tank.